So welcome to the May 2022 edition of the Cerini Connection. Since the pandemic has started, one of the things that we've seen in many of our clients and the companies that we work with is we've seen organizations go to a more hybrid model where they're working with their staff both in person and remotely. And basically what that means, it might be time to reevaluate space, reevaluate how you're utilizing the space that you have, maybe renegotiate leases and stuff like that. Today we have with us Paul Wolf, co-founder and president of Denham Wolf Real Estate Services, Inc. So thank you, Paul, for being part of this and welcome.
Thank you very much, Kenny. Very happy to be here.
So Paul, let's just jump right into this. So many businesses are relooking at their employment models. As I said, people are looking at things maybe more from a remote perspective, with staff demanding, more flexible work environments and people working more remotely. What does that mean with respect to office space that people have or locked into moving forward?
It is the question. We get this question really every day from our client base. And just for those who don't know us, all we do is represent nonprofits. So everybody I refer to as a nonprofit organization. People are still evolving. They're still trying to figure things out. When the pandemic first hit, a lot of people felt they had to take extreme measures. And many started talking about giving up their leases, going fully remote. Now it's morphed more into a more reasonable, more rational approach, trying to make changes that you can live with, that fit with your operational model, that make economic sense. For the past year or so, there's been so much support coming from the public sector that a lot of the nonprofit organizations we work with were in fairly good financial health. They cut their expenses, they had shrunk their staff, they shrunk programs, they had this income, so they didn't feel compelled to make major decisions on real estate, although in some cases, landlords were giving either rent deferrals or even rent abatements, and that helped. But now we're seeing that the subsidies are gone, the rent abatements are gone, and people are being forced to make harder decisions. So we're seeing groups now looking at, everybody's looking at their lease anew. Can they take less space? Should they repurpose their space? Are they going to be hoteling for staff that's not going to be in the office all the time? And quite a few organizations now, as they're staffing back up, are hiring from other states where it might be less expensive to hire somebody. So there's this ongoing evaluation now about what are the right things to do. And there's a lot of different approaches people are taking. I'm happy to talk through them. But what we always say most important is understand what's unique to your organization. There is no one size fits all, but we are seeing organizations take a very hard look at their real estate now.
So what are you seeing in terms of some of the options that people are moving towards? And I realize you said one size does not fit all, but I think people are still looking for ideas on things that they can do. How feasible is it to be able to go back to your landlord and have a conversation? How much space do people really need today in today's marketplace? How do you get the most out of your space?
So there's a lot of questions in there. So I'll start off. Talking to your landlord, it really depends, right? A lot of landlords were quite helpful last year. It depends on how much debt they have on the building, on how their lender is treating them. It depends on how long they've owned the building, what their basis is. Is your rent above market or below market? If you're currently sitting in a space and you're paying above market rent and the landlord is significantly leveraged, they really can't let you out or renegotiate, because by lowering your rent and reducing their income, they could be in default of their loan. So a lot of their hands are tied. Some of the older buildings that have more legacy owners, have been around for a long time or less leveraged, have the ability to meet the market. And we're seeing that with some landlords who are saying, I'd rather keep you, rather have you stay than go through the hassle of trying to find a new tenant, paying brokers, free rent, work letter. So it depends on the situation that your landlord is in. I will say, going back to the question of some of the solutions, a lot of the easiest solutions are really going to be furniture solutions, where people are looking for more space. Back up for a second. The assumption was that people are going to need less square footage now because fewer people will be in the office. But now we're hearing that people want more space between themselves and their colleagues. One of my favorites is we do a lot of work with healthcare organizations. They all assume as telehealth was picking up, they could shrink their footprints, particularly for the FQHCs out there. But in fact, especially those that serve underserved communities, many of their patients don't have access to good internet service. So a lot of these FQHCs have taken or converted old space into essentially a computer hub now for patients to come in and do telehealth from their office. So again, it depends on the sector, it depends on the organization. I'll say also the big investment most people are making now is really in technology. You need to have the technology that allows you to communicate with people and your constituency as you need to do to keep your operations moving. And again, that differs, but I don't know any organization that hasn't been investing in better internet connections, better cameras and better audio, so much so that there's a real price challenge, particularly for performing arts groups. And then of course, people are investing in ventilation, right? A higher grade of air conditioning system to get to pump more air through, better filters. I think I answered 2 of your 3 questions. I've got the third one, Kenny.
It's okay. I'll jump back into that in a second. I want to harp on some of the things that you just said there. So when we're looking at space, are you seeing that organizations are trying to create space that's multi-purpose, more multi-purpose? Are you seeing that people that they're still creating the typical office structure where people have a definitive space to work out of? What are you seeing out there, and what are you seeing in terms of some of the more creative ideas?
Real estate has always been usually the second largest line item on the expense budget, right? After staff, it's always real estate. So there's always been pressure to shrink, take as little as possible, be as efficient as possible. Open work plans made people more efficient, but a lot of people didn't like them. And all of a sudden, people were saying, "Oh, private offices are now better because you're more insulated from the others from potential exposure to the virus." What we're seeing now actually is that, again, it depends on the organization. We work with nonprofit legal services groups that need private offices. They're no longer willing to have 2 people share an office, but they still want a private office. The workstations, again, we're seeing the workstations getting bigger, where they used to be more perhaps by a tight one of 5 by 4. Now we're seeing 6 by 6 to give people a bit more space. So again, I think there isn't one size fits all, and things are changing. Some of the organizations with resources made significant investments in creating sort of comfortable lounge type spaces for people to work and hang out. We're seeing a lot more comfortable chairs being brought into offices. So there are incidental meeting spaces that are being created where you can sort of lounge and talk and work. Interestingly, we're seeing more people allowed to bring pets into the office because you're trying to lure people back into the office. You're making it as comfortable as possible for them. I would say, sorry.
Go ahead.
Well, generally, the trend we're seeing right now is that when people's leases expire and they have the time to make a deliberate decision, they are tending to downsize by about 20%. Those that were in an urgent situation a year and a half ago and did maybe a 6 or 12-month lease extension to buy some time to figure it out, some of them tried to basically just stay where they were and reduce the cost for that period of time. But we are seeing people now generally downsize about 20%.
Do you have, for those organizations that are tied into longer term leases, do they have options to maybe extend the lease and take less space, or what sort of options are available for them?
Again, it largely depends on the landlord. I had a conversation yesterday with a client that we put in to beautiful new space right before the pandemic started. They literally had moved in like 3 weeks before. The space was purpose built for them. They spent a lot of money on the fit out. And when I met with them, they said, they're a staff of 22 people. They've had 3 people in the office at most at any given time. So they're saying, we need half the space. We've hired people across the country. We need half as much space. So I reached out to the landlord. I said, "Oh, look, it's a beautiful space. You can probably release it. Let us out. We'll take another space in the building half the size." And their response was, "It's actually better for us to keep you there and figure out the rent than to now have to take back that custom built space and try to release it into the market." Because everybody likes to do modifications on existing spaces. So the thought that they would have to tear out some of this brand new installation was just that kind of waste of money just made no sense to them. But this is also one of the good landlords. There are a couple. And they've owned it for a long time, so they can afford to meet the market and do that. Some cases we're seeing people saying we're just going to walk away. We have 8 years left on our lease. We can't afford it. And they try to negotiate a buyout, and buyouts are very difficult and very expensive. But we have seen some that were successful where, I mean, typically buyouts are profoundly expensive. You might have to spend 50 or 75% of the remaining balance of your rent to get out. Again, last year we saw people being much more generous and letting you out for security deposit and maybe a few months more rent for transaction costs. Yeah, but it really depends landlord by landlord.
As we get further away, we're still in the pandemic, obviously. I mean, there's been an uptick in the number of cases here in Suffolk County. But as we get further and further away from that fear factor, I guess, that is brought up about by COVID, are you seeing that people are coming back to the offices? Are you seeing that you already mentioned there's been a change in space size where people need more space, but what are you seeing in terms of, and what do you think the future is going to be with respect to how offices are going to look going forward?
Yeah, so I have a crystal ball, as it turns out, so I can tell you exactly the answer to that question. I mean, the challenge is that people are coming back. We're definitely seeing it. In some sectors, particularly some social services and healthcare, there's a large chunk of the staff that couldn't not come in. Right? They were the front line. They had to be out there. And a lot of the management teams, seeing that, started coming back more frequently sooner. The people who didn't have to be on the front line, but they understand our people are out there, we should be out there. In the performing arts, people are largely back much more often now, and they are producing work. Straight up office space, it's not a lot of people coming back. It's still, I don't know anybody who's at a 5-day-a-week in the office expectation. Mostly what we're hearing is 2 or 3 days a week is the expectation. 1 or 2 days mandatory, the other time flexible as you choose. But the hard part is everybody, even the ones who are remote, when they come in, want to have a space to themselves. The idea of hoteling sounds great, but the reality is then you don't have your privacy. You don't have your space you define as this is my area. You come in with your laptop, you plug in, you do what you can, and then you move. So some people are still wanting, they say 3 days a week is enough to keep an office for me. But I think hybrid is here to stay. I think for the most part, you're going to see all offices allow some people substantially, if not entirely remote, some staff positions, particularly I'll say sort of the back of house type positions. And then the rest of the positions will be 2, 3, 4 days a week in the office. That is my expectation.
Do you find that we're going to see more and more people maybe moving away or out of New York City, maybe moving to like some of the surrounding boroughs, which are a little bit cheaper, to cut down the cost of space if people aren't necessarily having to come in on a regular basis and maybe you don't need to be in the thick of things?
It's a great question. And this is also still, it's very interesting that the way it's moving. A lot of people got priced out of Manhattan years ago and moved to Brooklyn or Queens, sometimes the Bronx or even Long Island. And a lot of them now have the opportunity to come back if they want, because rents are lower. However, a lot of those communities where they relocated their offices have been building up with more office space and more services for the people who work there, because a lot of people want to be able to walk to work. So we're now seeing if a nonprofit has to be in a location, they'll be in that location, they'll figure it out. If they have the luxury of choice where they go. We're now hearing people saying, we moved to Brooklyn 12 years ago, but I'm not coming back, even though it's cheaper in Manhattan than parts of Brooklyn, because this is where my staff is. This is where my employees they like to be able to walk to the office. So I think the biggest risk is really that people are hiring staff outside of New York State entirely. And I think that's a big driver of that 20% reduction in square footage, people who are 100% remote. Although I had a client yesterday who said they have their staff, everybody must come into the office 1 day a month because they want to try to have that opportunity to have people get to know each other better and to collaborate. But in that 1 day a month, you don't need an office for everybody. You don't need a seat for everybody. You need a conference room big enough to accommodate the staff, basically.
So are you seeing then that there might be more of a push towards like a WeWork sort of environment where, you rent a room or a small office with the ability to get a big room one day a month to kind of meet some of those requirements?
So we've again been addressing this for even before the pandemic because people were excited by the prospect of sharing, only pay for what you need. And I know several nonprofits before the pandemic and subsequent to the pandemic that essentially shut down their offices, moved to WeWork, and lasted about 3 or 4 months and said, you know what, that's enough. We're coming back because the environment was different. One, it's dense, right? And there was apprehension about density, certainly during COVID, the peak of COVID. But two, it's just you lose some of that independence, you lose some of that identity that a lot of organizations like. And then also it's not inexpensive. I mean, you're spending quite a bit of money for very little space, for that luxury of being able to access the meeting rooms when you need them. So we're seeing fewer people doing that. Although again, those that hire workers in other states on occasion will actually say you can rent an office in the other state for a day if you need it for meetings. And then they'll have a membership with one of these shared space programs that way.
Now, I know you also do a lot of design work to kind of lay out what that space is going to look like and everything else. When you're going through that design phase and you're trying to look at needs of an organization, I know you said that in today's environment, desks have gotten bigger, people require more space. What did the ratio look like in the past, space per square foot per person, and what are we looking at now in terms of that whole thought of square foot per person in terms of layout and design?
So we don't actually pick up a pencil and do design, but as our project management team oversees the architects doing the work, and we work with the clients on that. So we're deeply involved in the design of spaces. And I was talking to our project management team about this recently because 20 years ago, the average for a nonprofit, the average square footage per person might have been 225 feet per person. That's a rentable square foot, not a usable square foot. And if people are unsure about that, I'm happy to address that later. But that from 250, 225, it's been slowly getting pressure down. 200, 175, 150, depending on what kind of office you have. Today, it becomes a strange calculation because you'll have a lot of square feet per person in the office at any given time, but the square footage per person in total tends to be not dissimilar from most recently, say 150 feet per person or even less. Because if everybody wants a private space, even if you're hoteling people, you're cramming them into small spaces, you have that same kind of density. But again, the caution is this is still shifting. And we've had clients who we just did a transaction with a nonprofit who has 20 people and wanted 7,000 square feet, which is a lot per person, but they want to convene a lot of events. Right? So they host a number of events. And the challenge is that, will convening come back in the way it did pre-pandemic? They believe it will, so they've invested in large meeting spaces to accommodate that.
So when an organization is taking on space, how do they factor in things like growth? How do they factor in, those types of things that, because I mean, obviously you don't want to renegotiate a lease all the time. You want to make sure that you've got what you need, but you don't want to pay for too much. I mean, how does all of that work?
So you pointed to the holy grail of doing leases these days, which is flexibility. Flexibility is usually at a premium. Usually if you want flexibility, you have to pay for it. Either you're doing short-term leases with options to extend or longer-term leases with options to terminate. And landlords hate that. Right? Before the pandemic, landlords wouldn't do a lease less than 5 years, except in extraordinary circumstances, or if they charged you a lot of money, or maybe if you got a sublet deal. During the pandemic, there were a lot of 6-month, 1-year, 2-year leases, but that's going away again. So landlords want and they need for their lenders to have longer term commitments. So how do you build in the flexibility? There are a number of opportunities. You can negotiate aggressively for a comfortable sublet clause. that allows you the right to sublet without a lot of the hoops that most landlords use to make you jump through. You can attempt to negotiate for a first right to lease an adjacent space. Or if space comes up in the building, I want to have the right to lease that. Again, this kind of optionality will often come at a premium, but there are certainly ways to do that. It's why I think business planning consultants are so busy right now, because everybody's trying to figure out, what am I going to look like in the next year, right? Is this a blip where I have people working all over the country, or is this going to be this is going to be the future? So I can make those plans. Again, I think this is still evolving, but the optionality, you can, I mean, this is real estate, you can negotiate anything and everything is negotiable. It just usually comes with a cost.
I think if the workforce has a say in what's going on in the future, this is going to be the new normal. You hear it all over the place. People want flexibility. People do not want to be in the office 5 days a week. You know, they're looking for some sort of hybrid solution. So I don't see this as being anything but what the future is going to hold.
I completely agree. And especially with the pressure now to increase salaries, that the whole package that staff is looking for needs to be improved. So people are putting a lot of resources to that. And if you're increasing salaries, you need to take that money from somewhere. In a lot of places, people are looking to decrease the rent expense if possible. And then by giving somebody flexibility can hopefully help you reduce your rent expense. What people don't always calculate is then there's the cost of a technology to support remote staff. I mean, in our office, we were buying a whole lot of laptops, right? And to make connectivity a lot easier while being secure. And I know a lot of people are doing that. But there's, again, the achieving flexibility is a challenge, but if you know what you want, and we're huge believers in planning, if you know what you want, then spend the time to put in the effort to determine and define, these are our top priorities. It's a good way to start. And again, I think many landlords, especially not the big institutional ones, are more receptive to creative approaches today, but it'll probably cost you something.
Yeah, I mean, we've been definitely seeing organizations who are trying to find ways to cut back on or as they cut back on real estate, or investing more in technology. So, you know, we've seen that switch happen in a lot of organizations. So
I've also, interestingly, I've seen a number of people who are no longer employing full-time staff for some positions. They're either hiring consultants, and there's a lot I see hiring outside companies to do their bookkeeping and controllers and so forth. But also I'm seeing more nonprofits are now hiring staff on a project by project basis. So rather than paying a full-time salary and benefits, just say, I've been funded for this project. You're here for this project. You do this project. And then when it's done, then you're done. Which interestingly is similar to what people wanted in the sort of gig economy years ago. I don't know. I'm not sure if that's going to be sustainable long-term, but I would definitely see a move in that direction.
There definitely have been a lot of websites that have popped up and apps that have popped up that make it easier for those types of transactions to take place.
Definitely.
When is the right time for people to start relooking at their lease? You know, how far in advance should you be looking at this? When should you be approaching your landlord with respect to your lease?
I mean, I'm assuming most people looked at their lease when the pandemic hit to see if you had any kind of protection against, again, if this is an essential service you were losing, could you get any kind of rent abatement? Would your insurance cover it? So I assume there was a fair bit of looking, but if your lease is approaching expiration, you definitely want to stay on top of it. These days, it's maybe a bit easier to find space, but it will take longer to build it out because there's delays in construction, there's delays in materials. Anything that has a chip in it is certainly delayed. Contractors are busy. If you're doing a small office fit out, it's very hard to get people's attention because everybody's so busy that there's a lot of work happening. Our recommendation generally is, depending on the square footage, you want to look at your lease between, I'll say, 12 and 18 months before lease expiration. If you're in a tough situation now, if you need to adjust, make an adjustment now, Even if you have 5, 6 years left, you should review your lease and you should talk to your landlord. And I said this 2 years ago on a different webinar where I said, treat your landlord as a partner, not as the enemy, because right now you both have your goals are aligned, right? You're trying to stay in business, they're trying to keep their building full. And we had, again, landlords who are willing to figure things out. Even now, if you give your landlord enough time and you're very upfront with them, those that can, I think can be creative with you.
Okay, in terms of, and I mentioned this earlier, if I do have a lot of years left on my lease and I may need to, or I want to consider shrinking space, what have you seen work with landlords and what have you seen not work with landlords? I mean, I understand that it's going to be building contingent and, where the landlord, but what sort of strategies have worked with landlords and what sort of strategies have just been like outright no?
Again, the calling up your landlord and saying, this is what I'm doing, take it or leave it, is not helpful. Landlords might be more tolerant of or more lax on some of the sublet expectations that they have. The sublet market, unfortunately, right now is brutal. There's a lot of sublet space on the market. Things are taking a very long time to lease and the prices are quite depressed. So if you're looking to acquire space, now is a good time to acquire sublet space. Again, the experiences that we've had, what works with the landlord is open communication. So show them your 990, show them your tax return to say, look, you can see my funding is down by 40%. I've done everything I can to control my costs. This piece is significant, I need help. And at least they're cognizant of that. And I've seen that's where you have the best opportunity. I've had people call them up and say, if you don't let me out, if you don't cut my rent in half, I'm leaving. And they've said, great, my lawyers are lined up, ready to come after you. And unfortunately, now that you're allowed to pursue litigation for non-payment of rent, it's happening. And the courts will be quite full of that.
Where do you see from a buyer-seller's market, in essence, not necessarily buyer, but renter market, where do you see the marketplace today and where do you see it going? I mean, are we, you just mentioned that there's a lot of sublease space. How long terms a lot of those subleases? Do we have a lot of time on them? Is it something we can hop into? If we're not subleasing and we're hopping in, I tend to ask a lot of multiple questions. I apologize. If you're hopping into a regular lease, is there a lot of supply on the market right now? And where do we see that supply going over the next 5 years?
I think from a rental perspective, rents took a big hit right away, no question. What we've seen come back strong is the Class A buildings, the new high-end buildings that have fabulous ventilation and lots of air and light. These are actually renting at, they're breaking records and actually some of the rents that they're achieving on these buildings. The Class B, Class C buildings, which is the older buildings, have been struggling much more. Those rents are definitely down. And they could be down as much as 20, 25% from where they were at their peak. What we see going forward is that those high-end, the Class A buildings seem to be maintaining their desirability. And unfortunately, most nonprofits can't afford those. The B buildings, the rents are lower. The nice thing about the B buildings is a lot of them have operable windows. And people like that now for additional ventilation. There's a lot on the market in the B and C buildings, which is why the sublet market is struggling, because if your rent had been $50 a square foot, and now you're looking to sublet, and the landlord is now offering brand new space on a higher floor with a fit out at $35 a square foot, for you to compete, you're gonna have to charge $20 a square foot or $25 a square foot. And that's what ends up happening. So people are losing a lot on the sublet. But I think things are, I hate to use the word stabilizing because, I mean, there's still a lot of uncertainty. I mean, candidly, the impact of Ukraine, I think, is still fully yet to be felt. But we definitely hear people that are hesitant about making long-term decisions again now, because they finally said we're ready to make decisions, then Ukraine is happening, and then people pause and say, so what's the impact going to be on my world? But it's I think the market feels like it's hitting a new normal. Transactions are happening again. In my office where we do transactional work, we are much busier this year than we have been in the past 2 years. And deals are happening. It's not just people are looking, people are actually transacting. Because I think the market has hit a level where buyers and sellers are they have a meeting of the minds. By the way, you mentioned sale, the commercial condominium market, which I think is more common in Manhattan than in the boroughs on Long Island, but it's getting there, is robust now because the prices have come down. People that are holding these assets are looking to move them. And those that had all this pent up demand are now transacting. So we're definitely seeing transactions happening, which leads me to believe that the market has hit a level of stability, which I think is hopefully sustainable, at least for a while. We will see with interest rates going up, that's going to make a big difference on people who are refinancing their buildings and how tolerant they are of doing deals at lower rents. It'll certainly affect the buying and selling of assets as well. Sorry if that was a long rambling answer.
No, that's fine. I mean, how much are you seeing the impact of inflation? How much are you seeing that and the supply chain shortages and stuff impacting pricing of leases because of build outs and things like that?
I don't think it's impacting the lease prices necessarily, but the terms become an issue. So the rent might be what it had been, but now the fit out cost, the contribution from the landlord, which went up substantially during the pandemic to try to preserve high face rents by providing more capital. The capital is more expensive now. And for landlords to amortize that investment over the course of the lease at a higher interest rate is probably not sustainable in this market. So I believe contributions to fit outs are coming down. And I think the interest rate increases are going to impact that certainly. Again, we've seen a boon. It's been great for the past couple of months of great work letters from landlords. I think that's going to be impacted.
So anybody who's looking to move into space that's going to need some level of construction has to kind of take that into consideration and understand that it's going to cost them a little bit more for that construction because of the reduction in the build out allowances.
Well, and just the costs are increasing. I mean, construction costs. We oversee a lot of design and construction projects. We expected pricing to come down during the pandemic. It really didn't. And now again, everybody's busy and it's hard to get labor and people are looking for higher salaries and construction costs are high. They're higher than they've been. And the wait for materials is a very real impact where we are constantly having to look at projects to make changes. Those windows are 6 months delayed. You have to go to a different window. Those light fixtures are stuck on a boat somewhere off of LA. You have to go to a different light fixture. So those things are happening all the time in construction projects.
Yeah, we've seen it in some of our clients. We've seen tremendous delays where we've had schools that were supposed to open in July have to push out their opening for almost a year because of delays.
Absolutely, and there's a real need for school space, and the school marketplace again. There's a lot of demand for school spaces. Not that you asked this question, but I'm going to ask.
That was actually the next question I was going to ask you. Where are you seeing in terms of the marketplace where there are pockets of potential need, whether it be educational organizations, art organizations, office space, storage, all of those things? So
the challenge is that the industrial market has been the rock star of the pandemic. People want to acquire industrial property for last mile distribution centers. These same spaces used to be the affordable spaces that nonprofits would take, particularly if they needed high ceilings, wide columns. A lot of the arts organizations would try and be further away from public transportation. They'd rent them because they were affordable. Now, where those spaces might have traded in years past for $17, $18 a square foot, now they're $35 a square foot because your competition is Amazon or somebody who's trying to support Amazon. So the industrial market is still very competitive, which has put a lot of pressure on particularly the groups that have those special space requirements. I think office space, there's an abundance of it. Retail space, there's an abundance. We're seeing some creative uses of repurposing retail space for nonprofits, particularly for anything that where organizations couldn't in the past afford a retail presence to engage directly with the public. We're now seeing that there's greater opportunity because retail rents are down substantially. We're seeing demand in schools, charter schools in particular, that there's a lot of interest, there's a lot of demand. And finding that space is challenging because they tend to want a big footprint and they need the landlord to come out of pocket a lot of cash. Those costs for charter schools are up substantially. But
Yeah.
that's a strong
We've
area of
seen
demand.
that too. We've seen that to try to even find a space large enough to hold a school has just been incredibly difficult.
Absolutely. I want to say something positive and uplifting about the work of the nonprofit community. The reality is, if you're in the market today, you have options. There are opportunities out there for decent deals. I would say read your lease, and if you're going to do a sublet, be very careful because you're subject to whatever deal terms the master tenant negotiated. And if they did a bad deal, you are now inheriting a bad deal. So I would just advise caution, but there are certainly good financial deals out there.
We talked about potential sectors of the industry, office space, things like that. What about locations? I mean, Brooklyn, Bronx, Staten Island, New York City. I mean, is there one space, Queens? Is there one space that's better than another? Is there a space that's moving in a faster direction than another space?
I think I'll think about that one for a second. So there's a lot of new construction going on, both in Manhattan and the other boroughs. I think most of the transactions we're seeing now for office space are really in Manhattan, but for the program space, they're looking more in the boroughs, which I guess has been the case for a while now. There's a lot of inventory in Manhattan, more so certainly than anywhere else. So naturally, there'll be more availability here. But the Brooklyn market, particularly some of the sexier parts of Brooklyn and Queens, have been doing fine. I think in large part because a lot of the population lives there and they want to stay close to home. The Bronx saw a sudden increase in office space availability. And I think it was slowly starting to get absorbed. I think they're gonna be struggling a little bit because the Bronx, although very convenient in the South Bronx for public transportation, still has a bit of a stigma. But I think today, if I had a new client come in and say, I'm looking for the best deal I can get in office space, I want to be proximate to public transportation, get a work letter, I'd probably guide them to Manhattan in the Garment District or even Lower Manhattan, where you probably get a better deal than you would in Long Island City or downtown Brooklyn, because you have landlords who have a lot of space and they're willing to do the deals.
I think also when you're dealing with some of the nonprofit organizations that are providing services and need to be around the people or in the communities where people they're serving are, again, I think there's maybe a little less flexibility in terms of where they can go. But, ultimately, you're seeing, that's why I think you're seeing in some of the areas like Inwood and stuff like that, some of those areas, are getting pushed up because that's where, especially like for charter schools you mentioned earlier, you can't find space there in order to meet the needs of the community.
And I'll add that we help organizations buy or sell land as well as development sites. And currently, the demand for development sites, a lot of the nonprofits who wanted to do development for their own account or for their own purposes were getting priced out by all the high-end residential development. There was a brief moment there where that sort of abated during the pandemic, where there was less competition for those sites, but that is picking up again. And we're seeing now that developers are happy to acquire sites, spend the next year or two getting entitlements, doing design, hoping to break ground then in 2 years' time to hit the market in 3 or 4 years with whatever it is they're building. So the nonprofits, particularly schools that were looking to purchase property, are once again in fierce competition with residential developers. Nobody's building new office space if they haven't already gotten their financing or not already in the ground. Like new office space, you're not seeing new people acquiring land today to build new office space. But there's a lot of space still coming because it got baked earlier. So there's a lot of inventory coming online. And the general assumption is that the high-end stuff will get absorbed because it's a high-quality product. And if that gets absorbed, presumably some of the B stuff will free up, which will create more vacancy, which will create more pressure on rents to lower them. So again, I think there will be opportunity for tenants.
So if someone's sitting in a transitional spot right now, does it make sense for them to maybe sublet for a couple of years on a low sublet with the hopes that the market's going to drop down the road? Or does it make more sense for them to kind of hop into a space, or what?
I think it's a perfectly good strategy. If you can buy 2 years in a sublet, to wait and see how things play out. I think if you can get an affordable sublet at reasonable terms, and that should be no problem today, I think it's a great option. But you have to think about, exactly the terms of the sublet. Are you roommates? Do you have, real actual wall separation, separate entrance? Because a lot of people are saying, I don't want to spend the money to divide my space. Just come in, take a few desks. We'll be fine. We'll share. And that sometimes can be problematic because most of us haven't had roommates, since college. And there's some challenges of sharing space. But if you can get a sublet, I think as a way to buy time, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, we've actually seen some instances where, you've been able to sublet, or some of our clients have been able to sublet a whole floor. And it's worked out really, really well because it's been a cheaper price than they would have been able to get that space for.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you have that kind of need, if you're a large user right now, a full floor user or more, you definitely have leverage in the marketplace.
So real quick, we're running out of time, but what other strategies, ideas, pearls of wisdom, or anything would you like to kind of share with people?
So our mantra since we started Denham 25 years ago has always been mission leads, real estate follows. So invest the time and the effort to plan, because real estate should be in service to your mission. It should be a vehicle supporting your mission. So we like people to always have the opportunity to plan. It's hard to make major decisions if you're in crisis, right? If you can avoid that, that's the way to go. So by taking the time to plan, and by this, I won't go on too long, Kenny, but there's 3 things to look at, right? There's the financial, the physical, and the organizational piece. So understanding truly what are your physical needs today and as best you can anticipate for tomorrow. What's your financial capacity today? And again, it's about cash in the bank more than about, say, pledges. If you're raising money, you can't pay a contractor with a pledge. And on the organizational piece, to understand who you need to be in this transitional period. Like our staff going to be working remote. Those that are in the office, if they're co-located with another entity, are people going to get along well together? The organizational piece is often overlooked in times of hardship. But that's critical because you need your people to deliver your on your mission and your program. So that's a very long way of saying plan. Take the time to plan. And there are opportunities today, but you should be thoughtful about, don't just jump at the lowest price. Sometimes there's other things in there that it will justify why it's the lowest price. And you might want to pay a little bit more and get more control or a better deal. How's that for a long-winded?
No, that was awesome. This whole thing was awesome. So look, Paul, I really, really appreciate your time today, and I'm sure everybody else appreciates your time too. This was great. And what we'll do is we'll send out some your contact information if anybody has any questions. Is it okay that we share your contact information with them? I would be happy to answer any questions. Again, I love this kind of opportunity, and thank you so much, Kenny. That this is great, and I really appreciate the chance to do this. Awesome. So everybody, in on June 29th, we're going to have our annual half-day nonprofit conference. So we hopefully will see you there. Stay tuned for additional information. I know it hit our website today, and we're going to be sending out next week more information about it. So hopefully we'll see you then. Until then, stay safe, and we'll see you all next month. Thanks a lot. Take care, everybody.